I sent my mom $20,000, and she still told me not to come home for Christmas. That sentence might sound wild, but it's exactly what happened. And the worst part? She said it like she was doing me a favor. For 2 years, I've been secretly covering the mortgage on my parents' house in Cleveland. I didn't tell anyone. Not my friends, not my co-workers, not even my parents knew the full extent. Every month, I'd scrape together just enough to keep their home from falling apart. Meanwhile, I was living paycheck to paycheck, skipping doctor visits, eating ramen 3 times a week, and wearing the same shoes until the soles gave out. I did it because I loved them, because I thought family meant sacrifice. And because no matter how many times I felt taken for granted, I kept hoping they'd notice, that maybe one day they'd say thank you, or just ask if I was okay. But when I finally got the courage to mention maybe coming home for the holidays, my mom hit me with, "It's probably better if you don't." You know how Chelsea gets. Chelsea, my older sister, the one who's blown through every dime my parents ever had, the one who can't hold a job for more than a month, who disappears for weeks and always comes back with a new excuse and another mess. And still, somehow, she's the center of the universe. At first, I thought I misheard, but she doubled down. It's just easier for everyone if things stay calm, like I'm the problem, like I haven't been the one keeping them afloat this whole time. That call stayed with me, not just the words, but the way she said them. Casual. Like excluding me was logical, like my feelings didn't count, like the person who saved their home for 2 straight years didn't deserve a seat at the table. Something cracked inside me after that. A quiet, sharp realization. They didn't see me. Not really. Not the effort, not the stress, not the fact that I gave up my own life just so they wouldn't lose theirs. To them, I was just convenient. So I did something small, but it felt huge. I logged into my bank app and paused the automatic mortgage payments. That tiny click, it was like pulling the first thread of a sweater. Everything started unraveling. It wasn't out of spite. It wasn't even anger. It was stillness. Like I'd finally stopped fighting for something that was never mine to fix. I didn't scream. I didn't make a scene. I just stopped. And that's where the real story begins. Because when you stop holding up the weight of an entire family, they don't float. They fall. Fast. And the fallout? It was brutal. This story isn't about revenge. I'm not proud or bitter. It's about reaching the limit. About what happens when the reliable one finally walks away. About realizing that love without respect isn't love at all. And if you've ever been the one who kept things together, if you've ever been the person who gave everything and got nothing in return, this story might feel a little too familiar. Because this is what it looks like when quiet sacrifice turns into loud clarity. And it starts with a simple sentence I never thought I'd say out loud. I stopped saving them. It started with a phone call that should have been routine. I was driving home from work, stuck in traffic, when my phone buzzed. Mom flashed on the screen. I didn't think much of it. Probably something about the thermostat or a bill she forgot to pay. I picked up with a half smile. Hey, what's up? She didn't even say hello, just launched into it. So for Christmas this year, we're thinking it might be better if you sat this one out. I thought it was a joke. Or maybe I misheard. Wait, what? It's just... She sighed like she was the one under pressure. With Chelsea going through so much right now, it might keep things more peaceful if it's just her and us. You know how she gets. There it was again. You know how she gets. Every problem in our family has always been followed by that sentence. She lies. You know how she gets. She wrecks her car again. You know how she gets. She drains the last of the savings and blames the bank. You know how she gets. I stayed quiet, trying to process it. I asked, "So I'm not invited?" Mom said, "It's not that you're not invited, it's just, we think it's for the best, just for this year." Just for this year, like they were doing some big noble thing by cutting me out to make space for her chaos. I don't even remember what I said after that. I think I just told her okay and hung up. But when I got home, I sat in my car for 20 minutes, engine off, phone in my lap, just sitting there, letting the silence hit me. I wasn't angry yet. Not really, it was more like a slow ache. like someone had reached into my chest and twisted something that had already been hanging by a thread. And the worst part, it wasn't surprising. That's what hit me the hardest. That this didn't come out of nowhere. That deep down, I saw it coming. I'd been holding that house up by the skin of my teeth, and not once did they ask how I was doing. Not once did they say thank you. They just accepted it like it was automatic, like I was automatic. They never knew I skipped rent once to cover their late mortgage fee, that I maxed out a credit card when the heater broke last winter, that I cried in my bathroom when I got an overdraft notice and couldn't afford groceries for a week. But sure, let's keep things calm for Chelsea. It didn't matter that I was the one who picked up the pieces when Chelsea ghosted everyone, that I paid her parking tickets just so they wouldn't escalate, that I helped her out of her third failed apartment lease with a wire transfer I didn't have to spare. None of that made a difference. I was the backup plan, the invisible solution. I walked into my apartment that night and stood in the kitchen, staring at the empty counter. I had no decorations up, no tree, no lights, nothing that said holiday, just bills and a half-eaten box of cereal. I used to think maybe one day they'd realize everything I'd done, that I'd walk in and they'd say, "We see you now." But that call, it killed that hope, and then it hit me. I wasn't part of this family in the way I thought I was. I was a safety net, not a son, and I started to feel something I hadn't let myself feel in a long time. Resentment. That resentment didn't come all at once. It wasn't loud or explosive. It was quiet, steady, like a pot that had been simmering for years and was finally starting to boil over. I started thinking about all the moments I brushed aside because I didn't want to make things harder for my parents. Like when I asked Dad if he could help me with a used car loan after mine broke down, and he told me money was tight, while covering Chelsea's phone bill for the third time that year. Or when I offered to help Chelsea get a job at my company, and she said it was beneath her. I kept telling myself I was doing the right thing. That being the one who always showed up, who stayed responsible, meant something. That one day it would be appreciated, but it never was. I remembered this one night, about 6 months earlier, when I had to call off plans with my best friend Miles because I was short on cash again. I had just sent another $1,000 to my parents to keep the lights on. I didn't tell Miles why, just made up some excuse about being tired. That night, he texted me, "Man, you've got to stop bleeding for people who won't even notice if you're gone." It hit me, but I didn't listen. I told myself he didn't understand, that it was different with family, but was it? Because when I really sat with it, I realized something ugly. The more I gave, the less they saw me. My sacrifice wasn't noble. It was expected. They didn't just take my help, they built their lives around it, and in doing so, they erased the fact that I had limits too. Chelsea never once asked how I was making all this work. Not once did she say, "Hey, can I take some of the pressure off?" Instead, she walked around like she was the victim, like life just kept handing her bad luck. No one ever said she was reckless. No one called her out. No one looked at the trail of damage and said, "You did this." But me. I missed one phone call, or hesitated on a transfer, and suddenly I was cold, or distant, or not. Understanding what Chelsea's going through, it wasn't just unfair, it was exhausting. I started replaying every conversation, every skipped meal, every sleepless night, worrying about bills that weren't even mine. And the more I thought about it, the more I felt something shift in me. I had always assumed that love meant loyalty, that you stick it out no matter what. But maybe that's only true when it's mutual, because at some point, loyalty without reciprocity isn't love, it's self-erasure. I started journaling again, writing things down just to get them out of my head. I filled half a notebook in 2 weeks, and every sentence I wrote made something inside me clearer. I wasn't crazy, I wasn't selfish, I was just tired of being invisible. And that's when the resentment turned into resolve. For the first time in my life, I allowed myself to believe that I mattered too. Maybe it wasn't wrong to stop setting myself on fire to keep other people warm. Maybe I could stop waiting for them to change and start choosing myself instead. I wasn't sure what that would look like yet, but I knew one thing: I couldn't keep doing this. I didn't make a grand announcement. There was no text, no email, no confrontation. All I did was open my banking app and scroll to the automatic payments tab. I found the mortgage line I'd been sending every month for 2 years straight, and I hit pause. That's it, one tap. But that little tap was the loudest thing I'd ever done. It didn't even feel rebellious at first. It felt silent, like setting down a weight I forgot I was carrying. I stared at the screen for a while. After, no music, no TV. Just me sitting there in my small apartment, watching the word paused like it might change its mind. And then the weirdest thing happened. I felt peace. Not relief, not victory. Just this strange, still quiet inside of me that I hadn't felt in years. I thought I'd feel guilt. That was the expectation, right? That I'd spiral into shame, tell myself I was abandoning them. But instead, I felt calm. I made myself a cheap dinner that night, some eggs and toast, and sat on the floor to eat it. No table because I'd sold it a few months earlier when I was trying to catch up on my own rent. That moment stuck with me, because for once I wasn't eating while worrying about who I had to rescue next. It took 2 weeks for the silence to break. That's when I got the first call from Mom. I didn't answer. Then one from Dad. Then 2. Texts, then 3. Nothing specific, just call us and we need to talk. I knew what it was about. Another week passed. Then came the voicemail from Dad's number. His voice was flat but strained. Hey, got a notice from the bank, what's going on? No hello, no how are you? Just confusion that the system they'd come to rely on wasn't working anymore. The next day, another voicemail. This time angrier. You didn't tell us you were stopping. We counted on that money, Jordan. We counted on that money. I played that line over in my head so many times. Not, we appreciate what you did. Not, are you okay? Just that. We counted on it, like it was a subscription they forgot to renew. For 2 years I sent money without fail. No questions asked, no drama. I made sure they didn't lose that house. I made sure they had heat. I made sure Chelsea had a place to land every time she crashed and burned. And when I stopped, they didn't ask why. They didn't check if I was in trouble. They just wanted their lifeline back. And that's when I knew they never saw it as a sacrifice. They saw it as a service. That one decision, pausing that payment, wasn't just about money. It was about drawing a line for the first time in my life, about saying, oh, no more. Not because I stopped caring, but because I finally realized that caring alone isn't enough to fix a broken system. I didn't owe them my peace. I didn't owe them my future, especially not to protect a version of family that only existed when I was useful. I spent the next few days in a strange limbo. I wasn't sure what would happen next, but I knew I had done something I couldn't undo. It wasn't just a financial shift, it was an emotional one. So I left the payment paused and I waited. The silence didn't last much longer. About a month after I stopped the payments, Mom called again, this time with panic in her voice. I answered because I knew it was coming eventually. She didn't even say hello, just launched straight into it. We got a final notice. Jordan, they're threatening foreclosure. Her voice cracked like it physically hurt her to say the word out loud. I stayed quiet. She kept talking, faster now. We thought maybe it was a mistake. But then we checked the account. The payments stopped. Did something happen? Are you okay? That was the first time anyone in my family had asked if I was okay in years. I wanted to say, yeah, I'm fine. Just tired of being the invisible ATM. But I didn't. I just said I had to pause it. She didn't ask why, just said, but we're behind, Jordan. We don't have the savings. Your father's been trying to pull some things together, but... Then she paused. We were counting on you. That line again. I could hear Dad in the background muttering, probably pacing. Their whole world was built on the assumption that I'd always step in, that no matter how bad it got, I'd rescue them, like always. But I didn't say much, just said I couldn't do it anymore. She was quiet for a second, then hung up. That night I got a message from Chelsea. It was short. No hello, no pretense, just really classy move, Jordan, real mature. I stared at that message for a long time. Then, the next day, the real explosion hit. Chelsea drained the last $3,000 from our parents' emergency account. Just took it. No explanation, no warning. They found out when they tried to pay the utility bill and the card declined. Dad lost it. He called me, angry this time, full of rage, like I was the one who emptied the account. Why didn't you say something? Why didn't you help us get ahead of this? I wanted to laugh, not because it was funny, but because it was so upside down. I had warned them, not with words, but with actions. I had paused the payments, I had drawn the line, they just didn't believe I'd actually do it. Now the house was hanging by a thread. Chelsea had vanished again, and the bank wasn't playing around. Foreclosure. Proceedings had officially begun. Mom texted me in the middle of the night, "We don't know what to do, please call." I didn't. Not because I didn't care, but because I finally understood that their crisis didn't have to be my crisis. I lay in bed that night, phone buzzing every few minutes, and felt something that surprised me. Stillness. Not joy, not revenge, just stillness, like a storm I'd been bracing for had finally hit, and I wasn't caught in it anymore. They were spiraling. The house, the money, Chelsea's latest stunt, it was all collapsing in on them. But I wasn't underneath it this time. And for once, I wasn't the one rushing in with a bucket to stop the flood. For the first time in years, I wasn't the cleanup crew. And it felt right. It didn't take long for the private meltdown to go public. Chelsea posted a cryptic story on Instagram. White text on a black background. "Some people love to watch you drown after you've carried them for years." No names, no specifics, but everyone in our circle knew who she meant. Then came the flood. Subtweets, side comments. Her friends shared the post with little captions like, "I see you sis, and some brothers ain't built for real life." It was like watching a slow-motion train wreck, except I wasn't even on the train. I got tagged in stuff I hadn't seen in years. Distant cousins, old classmates, people I hadn't spoken to since high school, all started weighing in. One even messaged me directly, "Hey man, what's going on with you and Chelsea?" At first I didn't respond, I figured silence would kill it. But then I started seeing things that twisted the story into something unrecognizable. She's always been there for him, and now he's turning his back on her when she's struggling. Imagine being so heartless you let your family lose their home. The kicker? None of these people had ever asked what was going on, not once. They just ran with whatever narrative Chelsea gave them. And still, I said nothing. But then Miles reached out. He sent me a screenshot of one of Chelsea's stories. It was a long paragraph now, talking about how she'd been screaming for help while her brother turned off the lights and walked away. She ended it with, "Blood means nothing when money's involved." Miles didn't even comment. He just sent the image, then, "You good?" I called him. First words out of my mouth were, "You've got time?" We talked for hours. I told him everything, about the mortgage, the sacrifices, the phone call that shut me out of Christmas. All of it. He didn't say much while I talked, but when I was done he said, "You don't owe anyone silence anymore." So I made a choice. I didn't blast anyone online. I didn't stoop to their level. But I did start telling the truth, quietly but clearly. I replied to a few people who reached out with genuine curiosity. Just said, "Hey, just so you know, I've been covering my parents' mortgage for 2 years. I stopped, that's all." Most were shocked. A few apologized for assuming. And little by little, the tide shifted. One of our aunts messaged me a few days later. She said, "I had no idea you were doing all that, Jordan. I'm sorry, that's not fair." It wasn't much, but it was the first time someone from the family actually acknowledged the reality, and that was enough for me. I didn't need the world to rally behind me. I didn't want a scoreboard. I wasn't asking for sympathy. But I also wasn't going to let Chelsea rewrite the story just because I stopped cleaning up her mess. And maybe the most surprising part, when people started hearing the truth, some of them actually listened. A few even thanked me for being honest, and for the first time in years I felt like I wasn't yelling into a void. Chelsea's posts got quieter. The passive-aggressive comments slowed down. Maybe people were piecing things together, or maybe they were just tired of her theatrics. Either way, the narrative began to crack. After the public storm started to quiet down, the private pressure came back in full force. It started with texts. Mom would send things like, "We know you're going through something, but this isn't like you," or "Families don't give up on each other, Jordan." She never outright said, "Start sending money again," but the message was always between the lines. Then came the calls from Dad. They weren't angry this time, they were softer, almost rehearsed. He'd say, "Look, I know we haven't been perfect. I know Chelsea's had her problems. But we're your parents, son. And you don't just turn your back on your parents." That one stung. It was like a punch to the chest, because I had never turned my back. For 2 years I held theirs up. But they didn't want to talk about that. They wanted the version of me that didn't question anything. The one who just nodded and paid the bills. Then Mom started sending photos. Old ones, me as a kid, hugging Chelsea, smiling at some long-forgotten birthday. One message said, "You were always the heart of this family. Please don't let that go cold." I had to sit with that one. Because part of me wanted to respond, part of me wanted to fix it all again. That inner voice, the one they helped build, kept whispering, "Maybe you're being too harsh. Maybe they're finally waking up. Maybe this time it'll be different." But I'd heard all of this before, and every time I gave in, it went right back to the same cycle. They only pulled me close when the ground gave way beneath them. Never when I was struggling. Never when I needed help. Only when I stopped being useful. That's when the guilt stopped working. I saw the pattern too clearly now. Then they tried a new angle. Anger wrapped in disappointment. Dad left me a voicemail. "You think this makes you strong? Abandoning your family? That's not strength, Jordan. That's selfishness dressed up as boundaries." That one almost got to me. Almost. But the truth is I hadn't abandoned anyone. I'd just stopped volunteering to be sacrificed. It wasn't selfish to protect my mental health. It wasn't cold to recognize when love was being used as a leash. I started journaling again. Not just to vent, but to keep myself grounded. Every time I started to waver, I'd write out what I'd done, what I'd given, what it had cost me. And every time I came back to the same truth. I didn't owe them my destruction. Miles was a big part of that too. He checked in regularly, sometimes just with a meme, sometimes with a "proud of you, man." And weirdly, those little messages meant more than all the dramatic appeals from my parents, because they were real. Unconditional. No strings attached. Eventually the texts from Mom slowed. The voicemails from Dad came less often. Not because they understood, but because they realized their old tactics weren't working anymore. They even tried a third angle, shame by silence. Weeks with nothing at all, like they were waiting for me to break first, like withholding affection. Might reset the power dynamic, but this time I didn't cave. For once I didn't rush to close the distance, I let the silence sit. And in that silence, I found something I never expected. Peace. It was a Saturday morning. I was still in sweats, barely awake, when someone knocked on my door. Hard, like they weren't just knocking, they were announcing something. I looked through the peephole and there he was, my dad. I hadn't seen him in person in nearly a year. He looked older, not just in the face, but in the posture. Tired. Like the weight of the last few months had finally started to crush him. I opened the door but didn't step aside. He didn't smile, didn't ask to come in, just said, "Can we talk?" I nodded slowly and stepped out into the hall with him. There was a long pause. He looked at the floor, then back at me. "You really aren't going to help us?" I didn't answer right away. I waited. Let the silence do some of the work for me. Then I said, "I helped you for 2 years. I held everything up. And not once did anyone check if I was okay." He shook his head. "We didn't know." "You didn't want to know," I said. "There's a difference." He ran a hand over his face. "Your mother's not sleeping. Chelsea's gone. The bank's finalizing the process. This house, it's all we've got left." I took a breath. "You mean the house I paid for?" He flinched. I could see it. For the first time, the truth was landing. He had nothing to say to that. No excuse, no defense. So I kept going. I gave up everything, comfort, health, peace of mind, so you and Mom could keep pretending Chelsea was the only one who needed saving. And when I stopped, it all fell apart. That's not on me. That's what happens when you build your house on someone else's back. He stared at me, and for a second I thought I saw regret. Then he asked, "Is this really the hill you want to die on?" And that was it. The sentence that snapped it all into focus. I laughed, just once, sharp and bitter. No, Dad, this is the hill I survived on, alone, while you were too busy protecting someone who never protected any of us. He stepped closer. I'm not asking for forever, just until we can get through this. You already did, I said. You got through it. You just never learned how to stand on your own. He looked away, jaw clenched, and I could feel it. He wanted to guilt me, argue, reach back into the old bag of tricks. But they were all empty now, so I said what I needed to say. You lost me first, long before the money stopped, when you made it clear I was only valuable when I was giving. Being present wasn't enough unless it came with a check. He didn't respond, just stood there, breathing heavily, eyes somewhere behind me. And I turned, walked back into my apartment and closed the door behind me. No slamming, no yelling, just quiet. I leaned against the door for a minute after, heart racing, not because I was afraid, but because I knew something huge had just happened. The final line had been drawn. No more calls, no more begging, no more pretending. That door closed on more than just my father. It closed on every version of me that thought I needed to earn love through suffering, and it stayed closed. A few weeks after that final conversation with my dad, the house was officially gone, sold at auction. No more extensions, no more negotiations. The place where I grew up, the house I saved more times than I could count, was no longer in our family's name. I didn't find out from them. I saw it on Zillow. Price marked sold. Photos of the front lawn still brown from the winter, the porch swings still barely hanging on, and in the background, the same living room where we'd opened gifts, fought over dinner and ignored the signs for years. It didn't hit me the way I thought it would. I didn't cry, I didn't feel proud, I didn't feel much of anything. Just a slow wave of finality. The anchor was cut. Chelsea disappeared around the same time, deleted her socials, stopped answering texts. I heard from a cousin that she moved out of state. No one really knows where. No apologies, no accountability. Just silence, like a magician vanishing behind the curtain once the show ends. And my parents, they ended up renting a small place outside the city. I didn't ask, they didn't tell me. I only know because Mom slipped up and mentioned the new address in a group text she forgot to remove me from. They never asked if I wanted to see it, never invited me over. It was like they'd reset the story, one without me in it. We haven't spoken since, not really. There were a few half-hearted happy birthdays and hope you're well messages, but nothing real. Nothing that acknowledged the wreckage, the silence, the truth. And I didn't chase it, because by then, something had changed in me. For so long I thought closure meant fixing everything, mending every crack, getting everyone to understand. But now I realize closure isn't always about healing relationships. Sometimes it's about accepting the fracture. Sometimes it's about standing in the ruins and saying, this is where it ended. I didn't win. There was no victory. But I didn't lose either. I got out. I started sleeping better. I stopped checking my phone with that dread in my stomach. I had money left at the end of the month. I bought myself new shoes. I finally went to the doctor. I made a dentist appointment I'd put off for years. Little things, mundane things. But to me they felt like rebellion, like reclaiming a life I didn't even realize I'd given away. I started saying yes to things again. Yes to dinner invites. Yes to weekend trips. Yes to living without always. Scanning my budget for a mortgage that wasn't mine. People still ask sometimes. Friends who know the broad strokes. Do you miss them? And I do. In pieces. I miss what I thought we had. I miss the version of them I hoped they could be. But I don't miss the wait. I don't miss being a ghost in my own story. I don't know what will happen next. I don't know if there'll ever be real reconciliation. Maybe one day they'll see things clearly. Maybe they won't. But I've stopped waiting. Because this part of the story doesn't belong to them. It belongs to me. And in its own strange, painful way, that's enough. A few months later, I found myself sitting in a little coffee shop not far from my apartment. Nothing fancy, just a quiet corner table, a decent latte, and sunlight streaming in through a dusty window. And I felt whole, not fixed, not perfect. Just a present. I had space in my head that used to be filled with anxiety. I had time in my day that wasn't eaten up by budgeting emergencies or drafting polite, "Sorry, I can't help right now" messages I never sent. For once, my life was mine. I used to think being the responsible one was my identity, that it was something to be proud of, even when it broke me. I thought that if I just gave enough, proved myself enough, loved hard enough, they'd finally see me. But I was wrong, and weirdly that realization didn't crush me, it freed me. Because now I know I don't have to spend my life earning love that should have been there in the first place. I don't have to bleed for people who won't even hand me a bandage. I don't have to be the one holding the net while everyone else jumps. Now, I spend more time with Miles. We've got this routine where we hit up a bookstore on Sundays and try to one-up each other with weird finds. I started cooking again, not because I'm broke and desperate, but because I actually enjoy it. I'm relearning what I like, who I am when I'm not surviving. I even took a weekend trip to Chicago, first time I left the state in years. Didn't tell anyone, just packed a bag and went. Walked the riverfront, ate deep dish pizza, slept. No crisis waiting when I got back. No one even noticed I was gone. And that used to sting, but not anymore. Because the kind of people who only notice you when you're useful aren't your people. They're users. And I'm finally done being used. It's not that I don't love my family. I do. But I love me more now, and that's new. For a long time I thought peace would come when everything around me got better. When Chelsea got clean, when my parents woke up, when the house was safe. But peace didn't come from them changing. It came from me letting go of the fantasy, letting go of the guilt, letting go of the need to prove anything to anyone. Some people will never understand that. They'll hear this story and think I gave up, that I turned my back, that I chose selfishness. Let them think that. They didn't live in my skin. They didn't sit in my bank account. They didn't feel that slow erosion of self every time. I said yes when I meant no, but I did. And now I get to say yes to myself, to mornings with no dread, to nights where the silence isn't heavy, to days that aren't dictated by damage control. So if you're watching this and you feel like the one who's always holding things together, maybe it's okay to stop. Maybe it's okay to let the pieces fall. Because sometimes breaking the pattern is the most loving thing you'll ever do for them and for yourself. And for the first time in my life, I'm not afraid of the silence that follows. I'm just living in it.